Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that is both terribly sad and quietly absurd. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe sip something warm if you like, and let's drift slowly into the early 12th century. We're going to float over to a small corner of medieval England where a single night of partying, drinking, and poor judgment would ripple through history in ways no one at the time could have imagined. It's a story about kings, heirs, and one unfortunate ship. Yes, tonight we're talking about the White Ship disaster of 1120. Now, imagine England in the early 1100s. Henry I was king. Henry I, who had already made a name for himself as the youngest son of William the Conqueror, was unusually competent for a Norman ruler, if you can forgive me for saying unusually competent. He had survived sibling rivalries, rebellions, and a general atmosphere of medieval chaos that most people would have found exhausting. He had even issued some fairly sensible laws. Not modern laws, of course, but laws that didn't involve beheadings for minor insults, which was, frankly, a pleasant improvement. Henry I was also known for his, let's call it, meticulous personal management. He had illegitimate children scattered across Normandy and England, which he openly acknowledged because, well, why pretend otherwise when you're king? But among all his children, there was one in particular who mattered enormously: William Adelin, his only legitimate son. William Adelin was young, charming, and, according to chroniclers of the time, handsome, though you can imagine handsome in the 1100s didn't quite mean chiseled jawlines and Instagram-worthy hair. Still, he was the hope of the English monarchy. The future of the dynasty rested on him. By 1120, William was about 17 or 18 years old. He was energetic, well-educated for the time, and prone to the normal teenage inclinations: excessive enthusiasm, impulsive decisions, and, of course, drinking. Yes, drinking, because medieval teenagers didn't have video games or smartphones. They had wine, lots of it, and William was certainly known to enjoy it. Now enter the White Ship. The White Ship, or Blanche Neuf, was a luxurious vessel by 12th century standards. It was new, well-equipped, and commanded by a captain named Thomas Fitzstephen, whose family had a proud history of serving the English crown. Thomas was competent, but perhaps not especially cautious when it came to young, privileged nobles with wine in their veins. Or perhaps he was simply persuaded by the promise of prestige and wealth for escorting the heir of England himself. The plan was simple. William Adelin would travel from Barfleur in Normandy back to England, accompanied by a group of noblemen, friends, and relatives, all eager for a bit of fun on the high seas. It was supposed to be a routine crossing, a mere 3 days' journey to safety. But, as with so many historical disasters, the human element, overconfidence, indulgence, and poor judgment made the difference. On November 25, 1120, the White Ship was prepared for departure. Chroniclers later reported that everyone on board was eager to leave the port, perhaps impatient to continue their revelry at sea. And so the vessel sailed into the dark night, with stars overhead and a steady wind pushing them along the channel. All seemed well. But it did not take long for matters to go awry. Thomas Fitzstephen, the captain, had one major problem that evening. Everyone on the ship was drunk. Not just tipsy, but proper medieval drunk, which, given the potency of wine and ale at the time, was probably more dangerous than any modern cocktail hour. The young nobles were playing pranks, joking, and generally ignoring the usual cautions about navigation in the channel, which, for those unfamiliar, is a tricky stretch of water with rocks and currents that can turn a simple journey into a disaster. The ship's departure was reportedly competitive. Some say William had boasted that his vessel would overtake the king's slower ships. Of course it would, said medieval pride. The White Ship, captained by Thomas, moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, racing ahead under the full moon. And that's when the inevitable happened. They struck a submerged rock. It was one rock, a single innocuous-looking obstacle, and yet it was enough. The hull cracked, water poured in, and the ship began to sink. Now, here's where medieval tragedy becomes almost farcical. There were plenty of lifeboats, by 12th century standards, 2 or 3 small boats, barely enough for a fraction of those on board. William Adelin, in his youthful panic, managed to get into one of these boats, along with a few other passengers. But then, in a moment of overconfidence, or perhaps just poor judgment, he insisted that the boat return to rescue his friends and family still clinging to the sinking vessel. And the boat capsized. Everyone on it drowned. William Adelin, the future of England, was gone. Alongside him went nearly all of the noble passengers, brothers, cousins, and friends whose absence would reverberate for generations. Chroniclers later described the scene with the appropriate mix of horror and sadness, noting that bodies floated in the water, wrapped in their own finery, a tragic image that, of course, also underlined the impracticality of medieval safety measures. King Henry I, upon hearing the news, reportedly fell into a deep and enduring grief. He lost not only his son, but also the dynastic security that William represented. And in a way, the White Ship disaster marked the beginning of one of the most chaotic periods in English history, a succession crisis that would last for nearly 2 decades. Now, let's pause a moment and appreciate the absurdity. A single night, a single ship, a single rock, and suddenly the future of England was upended. No conspiracies, no assassins, just drunken nobles and a slightly overconfident captain. History often likes to remind us that sometimes the universe is a bit more random than we'd like to think. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. Henry's grief aside, England had no adult male heir. There were illegitimate children, yes, but succession laws, even in the 12th century, were not particularly forgiving of bastards. So, the country had to turn to William's sister, Matilda, who was married to the Holy Roman Emperor. And later, the prospect of her succession would be contested violently by her cousin, Stephen of Blois. But all of that lay in the future. For now, England was stunned. Chroniclers paint a vivid picture of Henry's response. He reportedly never smiled again, at least for some time, and became intensely protective of his remaining family members. The kingdom itself entered a period of cautiousness and uncertainty. Noble families, having lost so many of their young scions in one event, were suddenly far more wary of lavish parties and extravagant sea voyages. Not that it helped prevent future disasters, of course, but at least the lesson was painfully clear. Do not get too comfortable. If we linger on the White Ship itself, it's worth noting that it had been new, fast, and technologically advanced for its time. In a calmer moment, one might marvel at how quickly medieval engineers could build a vessel capable of transporting dozens of nobles comfortably across the channel. But under the influence of wine and youthful bravado, all of that craftsmanship was irrelevant. The ship was meant to be a luxury liner. It ended as a coffin. And of course, as history would have it, no amount of skill or planning could undo the randomness of fate once human error intervened. We can also reflect on the social dynamics aboard. These were young men and women, some barely in their teens, others in their early 20s, all raised in privilege and largely insulated from the harsher realities of the world. They had tutors, servants, and guards, yet the moment they left land, all of that protection vanished. The sea, impartial and unforgiving, does not care if you are royal or a commoner. It was a quiet lesson in humility, delivered in the most brutal way possible, yet recounted centuries later in a calm, almost soothing historical voice, our kind of storytelling, really. From a wider historical perspective, the White Ship disaster is one of those butterfly effect moments. It's easy to imagine England continuing on a stable trajectory if William had survived. No civil wars between Matilda and Stephen, fewer disputes with France, perhaps even a very different Plantagenet legacy. But life is rarely so tidy. A night of drinking and poor judgment changed centuries of European history in a way that reminds us how fragile dynasties and perhaps civilization itself really are. And yet, as we drift through this story, it's not all grim. There's something oddly comforting in the repetitive, inevitable rhythm of events. The sea swallows a ship, kings mourn, history moves on. Time passes slowly, and the human tendency toward error remains constant. In a way, it's soothing to know that even in the 12th century, young nobles made the same mistakes we might make today. Overconfidence, bravado, and ignoring safety rules in pursuit of fun. As we float gently toward the final moments of Part 1, let's consider William himself. A young man, alive with potential, whose entire life and legacy were lost in a few hours of poor choices and bad luck. History remembers him largely for the fact that he never reached adulthood, which is both tragic and, in our sleepy narrative sense, quietly fascinating. There's a poetic inevitability to it. The ship was white, perhaps symbolically pure, and yet it became a vehicle for one of the darkest nights in English royal history. So take a moment, let the imagery settle. Picture the moon reflecting off the water, the noble passengers laughing and drinking, and then the sudden quiet, the stillness, the water swallowing all that energy and promise. It's a night that changed everything, but we tell it now in a gentle, almost whispering voice, because history, at its best, is both grand and subtly human. By now, the white ship had vanished beneath the waves, and William Adelin, the only legitimate heir to Henry I, was gone. In that single, quiet night, the English monarchy had been destabilized in a way that medieval chroniclers would later describe with a mix of horror, awe, and a kind of resigned inevitability. King Henry I, of course, did not react in any way that would be described as dramatic by modern standards. He didn't leap onto boats, wave swords, or scream at the heavens. Instead, he did something far more Norman. He quietly and thoroughly fell into grief. Chroniclers noted that he refused to speak of the event for months, perhaps years, and some suggest that he even withdrew from court life for a period, indulging in a kind of melancholic introspection. It was the kind of slow, steady mourning that aligns perfectly with the sleepy, almost hypnotic rhythm of history as we tell it. But life, as it tends to, continued. Henry had to face the brutal political reality. England no longer had a clear male heir. He had illegitimate children, yes, but the norms of succession in the 12th century were merciless. You could be the cleverest, most charming bastard in the world, but the moment your father died, your claim would be contested or ignored entirely. Henry had to consider the next in line, his daughter, Matilda, known at this point as Empress Matilda, since she had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. She was competent, intelligent, and formidable, and yet the idea of a female monarch in medieval England was not exactly popular. Before we float into the succession crisis, let's linger a moment on Henry himself. He was, in many ways, an unusual king. A son of William the Conqueror, he had survived sibling rivalries, rebellions, and the constant plotting of nobles and barons. He was pragmatic, sometimes ruthlessly so, but he also had a streak of melancholy and caution. Losing William was not just personal, it was profoundly political. The stability of his kingdom, which he had carefully managed, was now at risk. Henry moved quickly to secure Matilda's claim. He gathered his barons, made them swear fealty to her, and attempted to create a clear legal pathway for her to inherit the throne. He even required public oaths, because medieval kings were nothing if not thorough in paperwork when their dynasty was at stake. Still, despite his careful planning, he could not control the opinions, ambitions, and temperaments of the English nobility. Now, here is where the story drifts gently into chaos, though not with loud clashing swords or dramatic battles. After Henry's death in 1335, the English barons faced a dilemma. They had sworn oaths to Matilda, yes, but the idea of a woman ruling England was unsettling. Enter Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Stephen was energetic, charismatic, and opportunistic, qualities that make for fascinating history but not particularly sleepy storytelling. He moved quickly, claiming the throne for himself despite his prior oath to Matilda. And thus began a period historians now call the Anarchy, a roughly 19-year stretch in which England was technically ruled by two competing claimants, though often in different parts of the country. Castles changed hands, loyalties shifted like sand, and chroniclers of the time noted the absurdity of the situation with a kind of resigned humor that a single night on a ship, a single rock in the channel, could lead to nearly 2 decades of civil disorder. Let's reflect on the human element here. The nobles, many of whom had survived the White Ship because they were not on it, suddenly found themselves swept into a succession crisis. Families that had lost sons or brothers were now being forced to pick sides, often against neighbors, cousins, or friends. Alliances were fluid, promises were broken, and England became a quiet, slow-motion drama of tension, negotiation, and occasional low-level skirmishes. Nothing cinematic, just a persistent hum of instability. Matilda herself proved to be a formidable figure. She was intelligent, resolute, and politically savvy, yet her gender made her path nearly impossible. She spent years contesting Stephen's claim, sometimes gaining ground, sometimes losing it. Her life, like that of William, was defined by proximity to power, yet continually frustrated by circumstances beyond her control. She held territories in the West, attempted negotiations, and even staged a brief siege of London, but in the end she never ruled as queen in the full sense during Stephen's lifetime. Stephen, meanwhile, ruled England, not always effectively, but with enough authority to prevent complete collapse. Chroniclers describe him as more charming than competent, and certainly more fortunate than William ever was. His reign was marked by slow, bureaucratic inefficiency, punctuated by occasional outbreaks of violence. Yet it's not the battles themselves that matter for our sleepy tale. It's the subtle unfolding of history, the ripple effects that began with a single night on the White Ship. And those ripple effects were immense. The loss of William Adelin meant that the carefully constructed line of succession Henry had planned for vanished. England's political landscape became fractious, with barons exploiting the uncertainty for local advantage. Even after Matilda's eventual settlement with Stephen through her son Henry III, the White Ship disaster could still be traced as a cause for later conflicts, including the 100 Years' War. In other words, one rock, one ship, one night of youthful indulgence altered centuries of European history. Now, if we step back from the political and military consequences, there are smaller, quieter stories to consider. Chroniclers noted, for example, that many of the White Ship's survivors lived with profound guilt for the rest of their lives. Imagine surviving a disaster that killed nearly everyone you knew, friends, siblings, cousins. It's not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but in the slow, contemplative rhythms of history, it leaves a mark. Some retired from court life, some became monks or nuns, perhaps seeking penance or solace. Others simply lived with the memory quietly for decades. There's also the broader maritime lesson. The White Ship, new and lavish though it was, illustrated the dangers of medieval seafaring. It was fast, elegant, and technologically impressive, but untested in conditions of drunken overconfidence. Navigational errors were common, and accidents like this reminded the elite that nature was indifferent to status. Ships sank, and even the most carefully constructed hull could not save lives when human judgment failed. Looking at William Adelin himself, one can almost sense the tragic, quiet inevitability of his fate. He was young, capable, and poised to inherit the English throne, yet his life ended abruptly in a moment of miscalculation. The tragedy is compounded by the what-ifs. If he had stayed sober, if the captain had been more cautious, if a different rock had been submerged or a different tide had prevailed, history could have been entirely different. But the universe, as it often does, played its hand and moved on. Henry I, for the remainder of his life, carried the weight of this disaster. His careful administration, legal reforms, and consolidation of power could not undo the loss of William. He spent years trying to secure Matilda's claim, though, as we've seen, the nobles were not particularly cooperative. And when Henry died, the seeds sown by a single night's folly bore their full fruit: civil war, anarchy, and decades of uncertainty. Eventually, order was restored under Matilda's son, Henry II, but the lesson of the White Ship persisted. One night, one vessel, one rock in the Channel, and nearly 2 decades of turmoil followed. History, as it often reminds us, can hinge on the smallest moments. The White Ship disaster is a quiet meditation on chance, human error, and the fragility of dynasties. It's also, perhaps, a reminder of the slightly absurd nature of historical causality. A drunken party, a boastful young man, an overconfident captain, and a submerged rock together changed the future of a nation. No dramatic battles, no conspiracies, no supernatural interventions, just human flaws and a bit of bad luck. And yet the consequences were vast, rippling across generations, altering the course of kings, queens, and empires. So as we trace the path from William Adelin's untimely death to the succession crisis, the reign of Stephen, and the eventual rise of Henry II, it's clear that history is both fragile and strangely persistent. The White Ship disaster may have been a singular event, but its effects were enduring. It's an elegant, melancholy illustration of how small actions or missteps can echo for centuries. And with that, the story of the White Ship disaster concludes. From the drunken voyage to the submerged rock, from William's death to the ensuing succession crisis, the narrative stretches across time, reminding us that even the quietest moments in history can have extraordinary consequences. It is, at once, tragic, absurd, and endlessly fascinating, a story that drifts gently into memory like the slow, inexorable tide that claimed the White Ship so long ago. Let's slowly wander into one of the more oddly satisfying scams of the 19th century. This is the tale of the Great Diamond Hoax of 1872, a story that is part adventure, part deception, and all quietly absurd. Now, let's float gently back to the mid-1800s, a time when the American West was still rough around the edges. Gold was king, silver was a close second, and diamonds, well, diamonds were the untouchable, glimmering symbol of status that most people only dreamed of. A lot of people in this era were already used to hearing tales of sudden fortunes in mining. You could practically smell the optimism and slightly singed egos in every saloon. And, as you might expect, there were always a few people who figured out that optimism could be, shall we say, monetized. Enter the Bond cousins. Or more specifically, 2 cousins who thought, why just mine for wealth when you can invent it entirely? Their names were Philip Arnold and John Slack, and they were an odd pair, united by family ties and a shared sense of opportunistic creativity. Philip was the more gregarious of the two, the kind of man who could smile at a banker and make him feel like he was sharing a quiet secret. John, on the other hand, was quieter, more methodical, and had the uncanny ability to make even the most absurd plans seem plausible. And here's where the story starts to get both interesting and absurdly slow. Around the early 1870s, these cousins were living a relatively normal, if slightly adventurous life out west. They were prospectors by trade, or at least they had been. Mining towns were full of people who would dig for months with nothing to show for it, and many had learned the fine art of managing expectations. But Philip and John weren't just your average miners. No, they had the ambition to take things a bit further. Instead of working for wealth, they decided to create it, or more accurately, convince everyone else it existed. The cousins had recently stumbled upon a peculiar insight that diamonds were rare, highly desirable, and, importantly, expensive. Tiffany & Co., the premier jeweler, was based in New York and had a reputation for valuing diamonds almost religiously. And of course, there were bankers and investors everywhere, all willing to throw money at anything promising outrageous returns. In other words, a perfect storm for a scam. Here's the slow, deliberate, and slightly ridiculous genius of the plan. Philip and John began salting a piece of land with industrial-grade diamonds and other precious stones. Salting, for those not entirely familiar with prospecting terminology, is a way of artificially making a mine look richer than it is. It's like sprinkling sugar on a cake you haven't baked yet and hoping someone buys the illusion of sweetness. The cousins would scatter these stones across a carefully chosen desert location, making it look as though nature itself had blessed this barren land with riches. But of course, this had to be done subtly. They couldn't just dump a pile of gems in the sand and hope for the best. They had to create the illusion of a genuine geological deposit, and they did this by carefully distributing stones of varying sizes and types. There were quartz crystals, garnets, topaz, and even a few actual diamonds. The mix wasn't just for aesthetics. It was meant to convince the most discerning eyes that they were looking at a legitimate discovery. And it worked. Slowly, almost painfully, the story begins to stretch its tendrils into the broader world. News of this diamond field started to spread. Letters were sent. Curious investors were intrigued, and slowly the cousins became local celebrities in the prospecting community. They were invited to show off their find, which, as you can imagine, required a fair amount of poker-faced charm. They would guide visitors through the desert, pointing out sparkling rocks and explaining the geology in the most plausible way possible. John Slack, in particular, had a habit of casually discussing the formation of the stones as if he had a doctorate in geology. He didn't, of course, but why let a minor detail like formal education get in the way? By this point, the story of the diamond field had grown far beyond a casual tale. Investors from as far as San Francisco and New York were beginning to take notice. These weren't just everyday citizens. They were bankers, jewelers, and other sophisticated types who ostensibly should have known better. But here's a gentle reminder in case you forgot. Greed makes people do odd things, or in this case, it makes them ignore glaringly obvious signs of deception. Among the most notable of these investors was Tiffany & Co., the New York jeweler we mentioned earlier. The cousins managed to convince representatives from Tiffany & Co. to come see the diamond field in person. And so they did. Picture this, a group of impeccably dressed New Yorkers trekking through dusty, barren terrain, all while being shown piles of carefully arranged stones that sparkled in the harsh sunlight. It must have been charming in a bizarre, quiet sort of way. The inspection, naturally, went well. The jeweler representatives were impressed, nodding along as Philip and John discussed the rarity of the stones and the geological oddities that had led to their discovery. They even purchased some of the stones on the spot for further study. And as you might expect, once Tiffany & Co. had shown interest, bankers and other investors began throwing money at the cousins, eager to get a piece of the diamond pie. Of course, we have to pause here to reflect on the sheer absurdity of it all. Entirely sophisticated men of commerce, experts in their field, completely duped by a couple of cousins with a few industrial-grade diamonds. And yet, that's human nature. We're wired to believe what we want to believe, especially when there's potential profit involved. It's a slow, meandering reminder that intelligence and common sense are not always correlated. Now, the cousins didn't just rely on the initial shock of discovery. They were careful, patient, and methodical. They knew that the more elaborate the setup, the more believable it would be. And so, over weeks and months, they continued to enhance their desert mine, adding more stones, rearranging formations, and subtly tweaking the landscape to reinforce the illusion. Every visitor left convinced they had seen something extraordinary, which, in turn, convinced others. At this point, the story could have ended in a single paragraph. The cousins walk off into the sunset, laughing quietly, while investors lament their gullibility. But of course, history rarely allows for such neat conclusions. There's always another twist, another subtle layer of human folly. And here the tale takes a slow, fascinating turn, involving federal scrutiny, scientific analysis, and a level of bureaucratic tedium that could put anyone to sleep. Eventually, the hoax caught the attention of Clarence King, a geologist working for the United States Geological Survey. Now, Clarence wasn't your average geologist. He had a reputation for patience, precision, and an almost painfully methodical approach to verifying claims. When he heard about the diamond field, he initially treated it with polite curiosity because even a geologist can be tempted by shiny things. But as he began to examine the evidence, it slowly dawned on him that something was off. King's investigation was meticulous. He examined the distribution of the stones, the geological formations, and even the types of diamonds themselves. Slowly, like a calm tide rolling in, he realized that the deposit wasn't natural. The stones had been placed there, carefully and deliberately, by human hands. It was the 19th century equivalent of a calm, nerdy mic drop.
As for the cousins, Philip and John, they were already gone. They had sold off their stakes, quietly collected their profits, and disappeared into the historical record with a calm, deliberate elegance. Their scam had been slow, meticulous, and in a strange way almost respectful in its execution. They had never harmed anyone physically, and the most anyone lost was money and perhaps a bit of ego. Historians and enthusiasts have since marveled at the story, not because it involved high drama or bloodshed, but because it exemplified something deeper about human nature. People, even the educated and sophisticated, can be persuaded to believe what they want to believe. Greed clouds judgment. Optimism sometimes outweighs skepticism, and occasionally clever individuals can exploit that perfectly. Interestingly, the legacy of the hoax had several long-term effects. Mining companies became more cautious, conducting more rigorous geological surveys. Investors learned, albeit slowly, that excitement and hype could be dangerous companions. The cousins themselves faded from public view, leaving behind only whispers of brilliance and audacity. Their story, though slow and oddly serene, would echo through history as a case study in careful deception and human folly. And so the great diamond hoax of 1872 concluded not with a dramatic confrontation, not with violent retribution, but with a slow, measured realization that the world's smartest bankers, jewelers, and investors had been quietly, efficiently duped by two cousins with a few inexpensive stones. It's a reminder that human nature, even at its most refined and sophisticated, is not immune to simple illusions, especially when those illusions sparkle under the sun. In the end, the hoax is remembered less as a scandal and more as a slow-motion lesson in patience, precision, and subtle absurdity. The cousins demonstrated that with careful planning, quiet confidence, and just the right amount of opportunism, it's possible to bend perception in ways that leave history scratching its head. Investors learned humility, scientists learned vigilance, and historians learned to marvel at the gentle audacity of it all. Philip Arnold and John Slack moved on with their lives, and the desert slowly returned to its quiet, indifferent state. The stones remained, scattered across the landscape, some perhaps buried by shifting sands, others still glinting faintly under the sun, like tiny monuments to one of the most elegantly executed scams in American history. As decades passed, the story of the hoax became a quiet anecdote in the annals of historical frauds. It's not a tale of tragedy or spectacular ruin. It's a story of subtle irony, gentle deception, and the curious ways human greed can be manipulated without a raised voice or dramatic confrontation. The diamonds themselves were never the point. What mattered was the illusion of wealth, the carefully cultivated belief, and the quiet brilliance of the execution. And so, the great diamond hoax of 1872 remains in the historical record, an enduring example of the calm absurdity of human ambition. Investors, jewelers, and curious onlookers alike are reminded that sometimes the grandest adventures don't involve battles, revolutions, or royal scandals. Sometimes they involve a few shiny rocks, two cousins, and a desert willing to play along. By the end of the story, what lingers is a sense of calm reflection. Not amazement, not horror, simply the realization that once in a while, human beings can be quietly outsmarted by the most delicate, subtle, and slow-moving of cons. And that is exactly what happened in 1872. The hoax is over. The investors recovered, if slowly. The bankers learned, if grudgingly. The cousins vanished, content and quietly smug. And history, as it so often does, observed the unfolding with a calm, almost sleepy detachment, recording the events without judgment, only subtle irony and a recognition of the odd poetry in human folly.
The peculiar life of one James Mangan, a man who in 1948 decided that the Earth as we knew it wasn't quite enough. You see, James had a vision, or perhaps a very persistent whim, that space itself could be claimed, mapped, and managed like any other nation on a political map. A sleepy idea to some, but to James it was serious business. He called his new country Celestia, a place with borders that stretched across the sky and beyond, where the usual laws of nations on Earth had very little sway. Now, of course, when we think about declaring a country, most people picture a small patch of land, maybe a flag, a little town hall, and some ceremonial ribbon cutting. But James preferred to skip the soil entirely. He went straight for the sun, the moon, and the stars. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on how James lived. A quiet man, not ostentatious, though slightly eccentric, with a penchant for writing letters. He wrote them frequently, sometimes to newspapers, sometimes to international authorities, and occasionally to no one at all. Perhaps the most important letters were the ones he sent to the United Nations, a young organization still feeling out its place in the post-war world. He informed them politely yet firmly that they were trespassing in his territory. Now, if you're imagining a stern warning with diplomatic language and lots of paper seals, you're partly right. But James also included his own gold coins as official currency. A small, round piece of shiny metal that said, in essence, "This is Celestia money, handle with care." He wasn't trying to hide the absurdity. In fact, he leaned into it.
James understood the sheer audacity of his actions, and yet, for him, this wasn't absurd. It was governance, international law, and personal ambition all rolled into one. He had, in his mind, accomplished what very few people had attempted, claiming a piece of the cosmos. James' story begins long before 1948, of course. Like many eccentric visionaries, he had a history of unusual projects. He was a meticulous man, methodical even, and not the type to launch a grand cosmic scheme on a whim. He had the mindset of someone who read legal manuals for fun and perhaps spent idle hours imagining the world differently. By the time he decided to announce Celestia to the world, James had spent years thinking about boundaries, territory, and the curious notion that celestial bodies might be claimable as the back garden or a small estate in the countryside. Now, this is where it gets slowly fascinating. He didn't merely declare his new nation in a quiet journal entry, he made it real, or as real as a country suspended above Earth can be. Coins were minted, borders described, letters sent, and international warnings issued. The UN, understandably, responded with gentle bewilderment. A country on Earth politely asking about the legality of being declared off-world wasn't something that appeared on the standard forms of post-war diplomacy. But James was persistent, and his persistence is part of what makes this story so quietly mesmerizing. He imagined embassies, not in Paris or London, but somewhere in the celestial sphere where his coins might circulate among the stars. The people of Earth, ordinary as they were gently reminded that they were, technically, living next to a nation that he had declared, and they were not entirely invited. James also made a habit of legal documentation. He filed paperwork, he drew maps. These maps, while whimsical in their claim, were treated with the seriousness one might reserve for a new subdivision in a sleepy rural town, only instead of streets, the maps showed the moon's craters and the orbit of planets. Each star, each visible celestial object was catalogued and given coordinates, a little dot with a name, a claim, and a date. He approached it like a bureaucrat rather than a dreamer, and therein lies the gentle humor. Let's float over to another layer of his personality. James loved the written word, not in a dramatic, world-changing sense, but as a slow, careful craft. Letters to the UN, to newspapers, and to friends explained his claims, detailed the coins, and even offered guidance on how to interact politely with Celestia. It was dry, it was formal, and it was slightly comical, a tone of sleepy authority draped over ideas that, in any other context, might have seemed like science fiction or a child's daydream. In the late 1940s, after the shock of global conflict had settled into something that might loosely be called normalcy, James emerged with Celestia. The timing was curious. The world was rebuilding, nations were redrawing borders, and here was a man quietly writing letters that said, in effect, "Actually, I own the sun now." The subtle, understated audacity is part of why his story is so perfect for a bedtime exploration. There is no dramatic action here, no battles, no intrigue beyond the small, persistent, bureaucratic rebellion of a man against the universe, just letters, coins, and gently absurd claims. He even suited up in his way, not in armor or spacesuits, which of course were impractical at the time, but in careful attention to titles, to legal phrasing, and to the image of a proper sovereign. The visual of a man in his home carefully drafting official notices about celestial property is enough to make one yawn and smile at the same time. The slow, deliberate life of paperwork and correspondence becomes the stage for something oddly majestic.
Of course, as with all slightly obsessive projects, there were rules in his mind. The moon couldn't simply be claimed carelessly. The sun needed paperwork. He considered the delicate implications of his claims. Could the UN object? Perhaps. Would anyone take him seriously? Maybe not. But these considerations didn't halt him. They guided him. like the gentle push of a sleepy wind through the corridors of his imagination. James also created a form of currency, as I mentioned earlier, a gold coin for Celestia. Not a single coin, but a small series, minted with care, designed to circulate, or at least exist, as a tangible representation of his nation. The coins were, in many ways, ceremonial. They were, in effect, a symbol of dedication to his dream. Yet they also added a weight of reality to something otherwise intangible. Anyone could declare a country, perhaps, but how many had minted coins for a nation that literally floated above the earth? There's something deeply human in that, isn't there? The quiet need to formalize, to create symbols, to document. James wasn't trying to conquer, to wage war, or to force obedience. He was trying, in the most bureaucratic of ways, to exist in a world that wasn't quite ready for him. And he did so without fanfare. No speeches, no rallies, no headlines screaming the news, just letters, coins, and careful documentation. His claims, naturally, didn't have legal standing on Earth. No court recognized Celestia as a sovereign nation, and no treaty acknowledged his rights to space. And yet, there is a kind of quiet charm in the persistence of his belief. Here was a man, in the middle of the 20th century, gently telling the world that the sky belonged to him. The audacity is subtle, almost sleepy in its delivery, but undeniable. As we meander through his life, it becomes clear that James was not eccentric in a chaotic, disruptive way. He was eccentric in a slow, meticulous, slightly absurdly logical way. Every letter, every coin, every map reflected this pattern. You can imagine him at a desk, ink drying on official-looking documents, thinking carefully about how best to assert his rights to a body of space that no human had ever owned. And so, the story of Celestia is a study not in conflict or drama, but in quiet persistence. James Mangan, armed with ink, paper, and a very particular vision, challenged the assumptions of what it meant to be a sovereign, to claim territory, and to be taken seriously, or at least politely acknowledged. There's something almost meditative about this. A man, his desk, and a sky full of possibilities that no one else had quite considered. We could linger here, thinking about the irony. A post-war world consumed with rebuilding nations and borders, and here was a man quietly adding another one. No armies, no treaties, no marches, just careful documentation. A tiny rebellion against convention. The sun, the moon, and the stars all claimed, softly, with bureaucratic elegance. And with that, we settle into the gentle rhythm of James's world. The letters he wrote, the coins he minted, the maps he drew, they are all quiet testimonies to a singular life lived meticulously, almost obsessively, yet entirely without malice. It is a story that encourages slow reflection, a slight smile, and perhaps, if you allow yourself, a gentle yawn. James's letters, as mentioned, were perhaps his most important tool. They were not fiery proclamations or dramatic manifests, but rather calm, reasoned, and often quite polite. They addressed them to international authorities, newspapers, and occasionally to private citizens who expressed curiosity. The content was always the same, a reminder that Celestia existed, that it was his creation, and that anyone crossing into its jurisdiction, even inadvertently, was technically trespassing. The gentle absurdity of it lay in the tone. He wrote as if one could casually remind the United Nations that, by the way, they were under his jurisdiction, and they might want to adjust accordingly. In some letters, James explained the purpose of Celestia.
not in grand ideological terms, but with a practical, bureaucratic logic. He envisioned it as a nation where laws applied to space itself, and where individuals could interact with celestial bodies in a regulated manner. Perhaps it was a whimsical attempt at order in a world that for him seemed slightly chaotic. Or perhaps it was simply a hobby elevated to the level of ambition. Either way, the result was letters filled with careful phrasing, numbering, and legal references that gave an impression of legitimacy, at least within the context of his mind. James also created a unique system of currency, as mentioned earlier. The Celestia gold coins were minted with the utmost care. They bore inscriptions that referenced Celestia's name, the date of its founding, and the authority under which James claimed the skies. Some were distributed to supporters or correspondents, others remained in his personal collection, a tangible manifestation of his nation's existence. The coins were, in many ways, ceremonial. They were, in effect, a symbol of dedication to his dream, yet they also added a weight of reality to something otherwise intangible. Anyone could declare a country, perhaps, but how many had minted coins for a nation that literally floated above the earth?
The reactions to his claims varied. Most of the world ignored him entirely, continuing their daily lives, managing their own nations, and occasionally chuckling at letters that arrived with references to outer space as sovereign territory. Some newspapers found the story amusing enough to print short articles, often describing him as a man who sued the sun or claimed the moon as his own. The phrasing amused James only slightly. He preferred subtle recognition rather than public spectacle. There's something quietly satisfying in being taken seriously in one's own mind, even if the rest of the world treats you as a curiosity. Over time, James continued to expand his claims. He issued decrees regarding the governance of Celestia, including provisions for celestial taxes and regulations for orbiting satellites, though of course satellites were just beginning to emerge in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He thought ahead, imagining scenarios in which humanity might travel to space more regularly and encounter his jurisdiction. It was forward-thinking in the most gentle, bureaucratic sense. There was no science fiction adventure here, no dramatic encounters, just careful, measured anticipation of what might one day be considered law. At home, James lived a routine life. He spent mornings reading newspapers, afternoons drafting letters, and evenings reviewing maps. His maps were meticulous, detailing the boundaries of Celestia with precise coordinates. Every celestial body, from the smallest visible asteroid to the moon and the sun, had a designated place within his nation. There were charts, tables, and notes, each carefully catalogued. It was a quiet, methodical occupation, the kind of work that could easily lull a listener into a sense of calm as they imagined him at his desk, pen in hand, quietly claiming the sky. James's personality, as revealed through correspondence and his public actions, was methodical, patient, and unhurried. He did not rush decisions, nor did he seek immediate recognition. The act of declaring Celestia, minting coins, and sending letters was an exercise in consistency rather than spectacle. One could almost imagine him smiling faintly at the absurdity of it all without ever breaking the calm, reasoned demeanor that defined his work. Interestingly, James also had ideas about diplomacy. He envisioned Celestia as a nation that could interact with other countries in formal, polite terms. There were suggestions for treaties, alliances, and the establishment of ambassadors, though in practice these were more theoretical than functional. He wrote letters suggesting that nations respect Celestia's borders and consider the legal ramifications of their activities in space. While these letters were unlikely to influence actual policy, they demonstrate the care and thoughtfulness with which he approached his unusual endeavor. As time went on, the story of Celestia continued, largely unnoticed by the broader world. James remained consistent in his claims, issuing letters and updates, and occasionally responding to inquiries or criticisms. There was no dramatic confrontation with authorities, no headline-grabbing incidents, only the gentle persistence of a man who believed, quietly and methodically, that his nation had a place among the stars. One could also note that James's approach to Celestia reflected a deeply personal philosophy. He seemed to believe that imagination and legality were not mutually exclusive. By formalizing his claims through letters, coins, and maps, he created a bridge between fantasy and bureaucracy. Celestia existed simultaneously in the mind of its creator and in the carefully crafted documents he produced. It was a nation both real and imaginary, tangible and abstract. This duality gave James's story a slow, thoughtful charm. It is worth mentioning, too, that while Celestia never achieved formal recognition, it inspired curiosity and admiration among certain circles. Some people viewed James as a visionary, others as a harmless eccentric. Regardless, the existence of Celestia stands as a testament to the quiet power of consistency and dedication. A man with ink, paper, and an idea managed to create a nation that, while largely ignored, was entirely his own. Throughout the decades, James continued to refine and expand Celestia. He considered legal codes, celestial taxation, and governance structures. He imagined a population, though in reality it remained theoretical. He even suggested ceremonial occasions, holidays, and administrative offices, all conducted in the slow, deliberate fashion characteristic of his work. These details, minor as they might seem, contributed to the sense of completeness and seriousness with which he treated his project. His story also gently illustrates the eccentricities of human ambition. James Mangan, in Claiming the Sky, reminds us that people seek order and recognition in ways that are quiet, absurd, or entirely symbolic. He did not seek conquest in the traditional sense. He did not wield armies or enforce compliance. Instead, he used the tools available to him: reasoned letters, currency, maps, and careful documentation. It is a story that moves slowly, deliberately, and without the usual fanfare of historical drama. In reviewing James's life, one can trace a subtle theme: the pursuit of legitimacy. He wanted Celestia to exist not just in imagination, but as a recognized entity. Though the world largely ignored him, he persisted, demonstrating patience, dedication, and a slightly whimsical adherence to the principles of law and governance. The gentle absurdity of claiming celestial bodies is softened by the calm, rational tone in which he conducted his affairs. Letters continued to circulate. Coins remained carefully minted. Maps were refined. The sun and moon remained firmly under Celestia's jurisdiction, at least on paper. James never wavered in his belief that his nation deserved acknowledgement. There is a quiet beauty in this, a reminder that not all historical stories require battles, betrayals, or intrigue. Some stories, like James Mangan's, are about quiet determination, eccentric ambition, and the meticulous creation of a world slightly out of reach. By the end of his life, James Mangan's Celestia stood as a symbol of the uniquely human desire to create, to imagine, and to formalize one's vision of the world, or, in this case, the universe. Coins, letters, and maps persisted as artifacts of a gentle, patient mind at work. He never achieved formal recognition, and perhaps he never expected to. The act of creation, the consistency of effort, and the quiet declaration of sovereignty were enough. In many ways, this story is almost meditative. It is slow, it is deliberate, and it is entirely human. A man, his imagination, and a sky full of claims, all conducted with polite formality and gentle absurdity.
It is a story of dedication, of eccentricity, and of the curious ways people choose to leave their mark. So, as we reflect on the life of James Mangan and the nation of Celestia, we find a story without violence, without grand spectacle, and without dramatic upheaval. Instead, it is a story of gentle persistence, meticulous attention, and the quiet assertion of vision against the indifference of the world. The sun and the moon, at least in James's documents, were his to govern, and for him that was enough. The letters, coins, and maps remain as quiet testaments to a man who looked to the sky and imagined his own nation. In doing so, he reminds us that history is not only battles and treaties, but also the eccentric, slow, and deliberate pursuits of individuals who insist on following their vision, however whimsical or impractical it may appear. We're going to float into a time when science and sheer human curiosity, mixed with a little bit of madness, led a group of young men to volunteer to eat food deliberately poisoned with chemicals. Yes, you heard that correctly. We're talking about formaldehyde, borax, copper, and other substances that, if consumed today, would probably land you in a very small, very unpleasant room with a very concerned doctor. Now, of course, we can't help but admire, or at least be quietly horrified, by the sheer bravery or questionable judgment of these men. Because in the early 20th century, before the FDA existed, food safety was, let's say, less of a thing. People bought canned goods, meats, and preserved foods without much of an idea what exactly they were eating. And if you think about it, the phrase, "you are what you eat," had a much more literal, potentially fatal meaning back then. So here's the setup. The year is 1902 in the United States. There's a chemist named Harvey W. Wiley. Wiley worked for what was then the Department of Agriculture, which is basically the ancestor of today's FDA. He was the kind of man who cared a lot about food, probably to the point of obsessively measuring its chemical contents, while everyone else at the dinner table looked at him funny. But he had a mission. He wanted to prove scientifically that certain chemical preservatives were harmful to humans, and he didn't want just any old evidence. He wanted direct, live human data. Because, of course, why test dangerous chemicals on lab rats when you can have young men volunteer to be human guinea pigs? Wiley's plan involved recruiting what he called the Poison Squad. These were 6 young men who agreed to eat meals laced with small, carefully measured amounts of various preservatives and chemicals. Their job, essentially, was to consume potential poison in the name of science, and they signed up voluntarily, which, if you think about it, is either incredibly brave or remarkably foolish, probably a little of both. Now, you might imagine that the meals were like a single piece of bread with a drop of formaldehyde, but no. Wiley's approach was methodical. They ate these chemicals in regular meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And he kept careful records of everything. He measured exactly how much borax, copper sulfate, formaldehyde, and other additives were consumed. He noted the effects on their digestion, energy, mood, and overall health. He wrote it all down in meticulous detail, probably while quietly muttering to himself about the dangers of chemically treated meat. And here's something a bit darkly humorous. The men weren't exactly passive participants. They were young, energetic, and often complained about the meals in ways that modern volunteers probably would too. They'd comment on taste, texture, and sometimes dramatic symptoms like nausea or stomach discomfort. So while the process was scientific, it also had moments that were quietly human and even a little absurd. Imagine a dinner table with 6 guys grimacing over borax-laden beef stew while a chemist scribbles notes, nods seriously, and occasionally mutters, "Yes, yes, fascinating." The chemicals themselves were fascinating in a grim sort of way.
Borax, for instance, was widely used in foods at the time to preserve canned goods and baked goods. It sounds harmless, doesn't it? But consuming it regularly in these experimental quantities caused gastrointestinal distress. Nausea, diarrhea, headaches, and general malaise were common. And yet, these young men continued eating the meals because they were motivated, apparently, by patriotism, scientific curiosity, or perhaps a vague sense of adventure. Formaldehyde, meanwhile, was used to preserve milk and other perishables. Today, we think of it as the stuff in biology labs that makes frogs stiff and slightly terrifying. Back then, the idea of drinking it in small doses was strangely acceptable, or at least tolerable enough for a volunteer study. Copper sulfate, another chemical Wiley tested, was added to some canned goods. It's a bright blue crystalline substance that probably made the food look a little more interesting than it tasted. And in the body, it could cause all sorts of unpleasant reactions, including vomiting and stomach pain. Wiley's meticulous notes detailed every reaction, every moment of discomfort, and every minor triumph. He was particularly interested in identifying sublethal doses, that is, quantities that were not enough to kill someone outright, but could still make them sick or damage their health over time. In a way, the Poison Squad were pioneers of toxicology, though perhaps unwillingly. And their daily lives became, for several months, a careful balancing act between nutrition, endurance, and sheer human tolerance for chemicals. One of the most interesting parts about this experiment is that it was continuous. The men didn't just try one meal and call it a day. They ate chemically treated meals over weeks and months. Each day brought new combinations of preservatives, new doses, and new observations. Wiley adjusted his experiments based on prior reactions, sometimes increasing doses slightly to test thresholds, sometimes decreasing them when the volunteers experienced excessive discomfort. You might be imagining this as a horror scenario, with dramatic screaming and fainting, but it wasn't exactly like that. The men were remarkably stoic, probably because they were young, healthy, and very motivated. They tolerated what would be considered unpleasant or even dangerous amounts of chemicals in a calm, measured way. And Wiley documented it all in a tone that, reading it now, is almost sleepy in its precision. There's no sensationalism in the records, just careful observation, sometimes interrupted by the volunteers' dry comments. "I feel queasy today, sir," or "the meat tastes a little metallic." Let's float over to another interesting aspect of this study, the social and political context of this study. At the time, the public was largely unaware of what preservatives were in their food. Companies added borax, formaldehyde, and other substances because they were cheap and effective. No one was checking the long-term health consequences. And this, of course, is why Wiley's work was important. His data, drawn from the Poison Squad, eventually helped shape early food safety regulations. The men, in their quiet, stoic way, contributed directly to protecting millions of people from unknowingly consuming harmful chemicals. Of course, it's worth noting that these experiments were not without controversy. Even in their own time, some considered it morally questionable to have volunteers consume known poisons, even in measured doses. But Wiley's reputation as a dedicated chemist, combined with the volunteers' willingness, allowed the study to continue. In some ways, the Poison Squad were heroes of modern toxicology, though perhaps not in the traditional glamorous sense. Their heroism was quiet, repetitive, and measured, almost like a meditation on human endurance in the name of science. The experiment also revealed some subtle truths about the chemicals themselves. For example, small amounts of borax might not kill you, but regular consumption could lead to cumulative effects. Formaldehyde, meanwhile, while effective at preserving milk, caused nausea, headaches, and other unpleasant symptoms. Copper sulfate similarly induced vomiting and general discomfort. These observations were crucial in convincing lawmakers and the public that certain additives should be restricted. Without the poison squad, these insights might have taken years longer to emerge, and widespread consumption of harmful chemicals could have continued unchecked. One of the more oddly charming details of the experiment is how Wiley documented the volunteers' moods and behaviors. He wasn't just concerned with stomach aches, he noted changes in energy levels, sleep patterns, and even emotional states. He described the men as sometimes irritable after consuming certain doses, or unusually lethargic following particularly heavy meals. It's a reminder that these weren't just numbers on a page. They were living, breathing humans experiencing the subtle effects of chemical ingestion day after day. The volunteers themselves developed a kind of camaraderie. They shared notes on taste, compared experiences, and sometimes joked quietly about the ordeal. There's a passage in Wiley's journal describing one man refusing a particularly borax-heavy dish with the understated comment, "I think my stomach might revolt before I do." It's a dry, small moment of humor in an otherwise clinical setting, and it humanizes the experiment in a way that modern audiences can appreciate. As the study continued, the results became increasingly clear. Certain preservatives, even in small doses, could have measurable health impacts over time. The men's repeated exposure allowed Wiley to identify thresholds for safety and toxicity, contributing to the development of early food safety standards. And while the participants were quietly brave, there's an ironic undertone. They endured months of chemical-laced meals so that future generations could enjoy safer, less chemically adulterated food without ever knowing it in the moment. By the end of the study, Wiley had amassed an impressive amount of data. His detailed records of symptoms, dosage, and outcomes were instrumental in advocating for legislation that would eventually lead to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This law, in essence, marked the beginning of the FDA and a more formal approach to regulating what went into people's bodies. The Poison Squad's quiet endurance had tangible, long-lasting effects on public health policy. It's also worth reflecting on the tone of the entire endeavor. Despite the inherent danger, the experiment was conducted with meticulous care, measured doses, and careful observation. There's something strangely soothing in the methodical approach, almost as if the entire ordeal were a very long, slow meditation on human tolerance, chemistry, and the pursuit of knowledge. It's a story that can lull you into a contemplative state, appreciating both the bravery and the mundane, repetitive nature of scientific experimentation in the early 20th century. And so, as we gently wind through the history of the Poison Squad, we see a confluence of curiosity, courage, and human fallibility. 6 young men quietly enduring meals most people today would find intolerable became the unsung pioneers of modern food safety. Their story is not dramatic in the traditional sense. There are no sword fights, no epic betrayals, just meals, chemicals, careful observation, and a persistent, slightly obsessive chemist taking meticulous notes. We gently glide deeper into the daily lives of the Poison Squad. By now, they had settled into a rhythm, a quiet monotony punctuated only by the subtle discomforts of chemically laced meals. One can almost imagine the scene: 6 young men neatly lined up at a plain wooden table,
silverware in hand, staring at carefully measured portions of food, their faces a blend of mild distaste and stoic endurance. And overseeing it all, Harvey Wiley, notebook open, spectacles perched firmly, jotting down observations with a calm intensity that could almost be hypnotic. It's important to remember that this was not a sensational experiment in the sense of high drama or danger. The men were healthy, the doses carefully calculated, and Wiley's approach meticulous. Yet in the quiet repetition of meals, doses, notes, and observations, there was a subtle beauty in the experiment, a strange harmony of human endurance, curiosity, and the slow unfolding of scientific knowledge. Each day brought minor adjustments, a little more borax here, a touch less formaldehyde there, slight changes in meal composition to observe the cumulative effects of repeated chemical ingestion. The men began to notice patterns themselves. One would feel a dull headache after copper-laced meals. Another would experience mild nausea after borax-heavy portions. Yet all continued with a patient persistence that was quietly admirable. In letters and diaries, some of the volunteers reflected on the experience. They were aware of the oddity of their situation, eating chemicals deliberately, but they also understood the importance. One man wrote almost in a sleepy sort of awe that it felt like they were quietly paving the way for a safer future for people who might never know their names. There's something profoundly tranquil about that perspective, participating in a small, almost invisible act of public service without fanfare, without recognition, in a slow, measured rhythm that mirrors the way life itself quietly unfolds. Wiley, meanwhile, continued to refine his methods. He began analyzing not just immediate reactions, but subtle, longer-term effects. Changes in appetite, sleep patterns, digestion, and general energy. This required patience, repetition, and a kind of gentle observation that today might seem almost meditative. The men's reactions, their quiet endurance, and the detailed records provided a unique glimpse into the human capacity for resilience in the service of science. Over time, the results became increasingly clear. Certain chemicals, while effective preservatives, caused measurable adverse effects, even in small doses. Borax, commonly used in baked goods and canned foods, could induce gastrointestinal distress and headaches. Copper sulfate, sometimes used to preserve canned fruits and vegetables, could cause nausea and vomiting. Formaldehyde, while effective at preserving milk, left subtle yet noticeable effects on energy levels and overall well-being. The data was precise, methodical, and quietly persuasive. The implications extended beyond the laboratory. At the time, food safety was largely unregulated. Consumers had little awareness of what chemicals were in their meals, and companies had few restrictions on what could be added to products. The Poison Squad's careful, patient work, combined with Wiley's meticulous documentation, helped lay the groundwork for early food safety laws. This eventually culminated in the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, a milestone that shaped the way food was regulated and protected millions of people from the unseen dangers of chemically adulterated products. It's worth noting that the men themselves didn't receive public accolades. Their contribution was quiet, almost invisible, yet undeniably significant. They endured discomfort, minor illness, and the subtle psychological strain of consuming known chemicals, all in the name of knowledge and public welfare.
And perhaps in the monotony of daily meals and notes, there was a form of quiet heroism, a gentle courage that exists not in dramatic acts, but in steadfast endurance over time. The end of the study marked a kind of gentle closure. Wiley published his findings, and the data from the Poison Squad quietly entered the annals of scientific literature. The men returned to ordinary life, carrying with them the memories of months spent eating chemically treated meals with calm persistence. Some went on to other careers. Some perhaps reflected quietly on the unusual chapter in their youth, and all were part of a story that, in a subtle way, changed the course of public health. Looking back, the Poison Squad reminds us that history is often made not through loud gestures or dramatic battles, but through patient, careful work done by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. 6 young men, quietly consuming meals laced with preservatives, and a chemist who took meticulous notes, together contributed to a safer, healthier world. Their story is not thrilling in the conventional sense. There are no sword fights, no explosions, no dramatic cliffhangers. Just meals, chemicals, careful observation, and human endurance in its quiet, steadfast form. It's a story that lulls you into reflection. One can almost hear the soft scratch of a pen on paper as Wiley notes yet another minor reaction, the gentle clink of silverware on a plate, the low, almost imperceptible groan of a stomach adjusting to copper sulfate. And in these small, repetitive moments, history quietly unfolds. So, as we gently close the chapter on the Poison Squad, we can appreciate the strange, calm heroism of these men. They were not celebrated in their time, but their work mattered, their endurance mattered, their quiet persistence mattered, and through their story we can reflect on the subtleties of history, the small, repetitive acts of courage, curiosity, and human perseverance that ripple outward, sometimes unseen, into the broader tapestry of human experience. And now, as you settle in, perhaps ready to drift off into sleep, let's take a quiet moment to appreciate this gentle, unusual story. A tale of chemicals, careful measurement, and calm human courage. A story that reminds us that history doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. So, dim your lights, take a deep breath, and let your mind rest on the quiet bravery of the Poison Squad. May your dreams be free of borax-laced beef stew, copper-tinted desserts, and formaldehyde milk, and instead carry the gentle rhythm of history itself. Good night.